Anyway, this is our first Sangha Night, our first normal Sangha Night of the new year. And New Year's are a good time for making new starts. It's a good time to step out of some of the unhelpful patterns we've built up over the last 12 months and get back to what our life is really about. Getting back on track. So we might be doing something like that in our own lives. You might have made all sorts of resolutions, I don't know. We might be doing that in our own lives, sort of getting back to what our top priorities are, getting rid of old patterns. And what I'm going to talk about tonight is how Buddhism itself did that. About 500 years or so after the death of the historical Buddha, how it got back to what it was really all about, in a sense. But before I do that, I need to recap a bit on our theme. I need to recap a bit on our theme for those people who are new to these Tuesdays, but also for the rest of us as well, because it's just important to sort of connect with where we are and where we're going. So since the autumn, our theme on these Tuesday nights and the talks on these Tuesday nights, we've called Buddhism through time and space. So we've been looking at how Buddhism spread and developed from its roots in northern India and how it manifested and what we can learn from that. So Buddhism began, as you must know, with the teachings of the Buddha and the establishment of the early Sangha about 500 years before the beginning of the Christian era in northern India. But from there, Buddhism spread to some very, very different cultures. And it's been around for 2,500 years. And in all those very different places, very different environments, over all that stretch of time, Buddhism has evolved. It's evolved in various ways to suit those conditions. It's become a very rich and a very diverse tradition, even a slightly bewildering tradition at times. So Buddhism is essentially a collection of tools. It's a collection of methods for helping human beings to grow and develop, to be more aware, more connected with others, wiser. So the teachings of Buddhism, they're a collection of tools to help us become more enlightened. And the most essential of those tools in the Dharma, the most fundamental, were taught by the historical Buddha 2,500 years ago in northern India. And any school of Buddhism that's really Buddhism will base itself on those fundamental tools, or at least on some version of those. So the Buddha taught the mindfulness of breathing as a really crucial meditation practice. He taught taught the importance of mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of the feelings, mindfulness of the thoughts, mindfulness of the world about us. Awareness, it's about awareness. The Buddha taught the metta bhavana. He taught the importance of a warm, positive heart, a warm, positive attitude to the world. He stressed that, the importance of a warm, positive heart. The Buddha taught the 5 ethical precepts that you all heard about in introductory classes and that we try to follow. Talked about the need to live with kindness, the need to base our lives on generosity, not stinginess, the need not to live without excessive craving, to cultivate simplicity and contentment. He talked about the need to be honest and straightforward. He talked about the need to cultivate our awareness and not cultivate escapism. The Buddha taught the overriding importance of spiritual friendship and Sangha. The need to be part of a community of people with similar spiritual ideals if we're going to get anywhere. So he taught all those things that, they're the bedrock of Buddhism. They're the bedrock of Buddhism. And those teachings also are the bedrock of the Buddhism that Triratna tries to spread, tries to teach. So that's the bedrock. But then as Buddhism spread to different cultures and passed through all those different historical eras, it adapted that basic toolkit to suit different temperaments, different types of human beings, different historical eras, different cultures. And so that what we've got now is this bewildering variety. If we look at the Dharma, we've got this bewildering variety of different schools and styles of Buddhism. I mean, Japanese Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism and Sri Lankan Buddhism all look very different. And then even within one country, say Japan, we've got lots and lots of different schools, some of which it's really difficult to see what they've got in common. So we've got this bewildering variety. And that's what we're going to be exploring in these Sangha Nights. That's what we're exploring in this theme of Buddhism through time and space. We're going to be exploring this rich culture of Buddhism, this really rich and diverse toolkit. But we won't be doing that out of a sort of academic or historical interest. We're doing that, this isn't a sort of evening class in Buddhist history or something. We're doing that, we'll be looking at how the Buddhist tradition has evolved to help different people, practice in different circumstances and different cultures, as a way of exploring how we can practice effectively in our time and our place. So that's the overall theme that we're looking at, Buddhism through time and space, and that's the sort of approach we're taking to it. And since the autumn, we've been looking at the beginnings. We've been looking at Buddhism, as far as we can know, the sort of early style of Buddhism that was taught by the historical Buddha in northern India 2,500 years ago. The main source for that is a collection, an amazing collection of books called the Pali Canon, written in the Pali language, which might be related to some language that the Buddha spoke, although it's a later development. But there's this amazing record, a huge great record of the Buddha's teachings, stories of the Buddha's life, stories of the early Sangha. And that's what we've been looking at for the last few months. We've been looking at that bedrock of Buddhism, those basic teachings, those fundamental teachings, the bedrock on which all the rest is built, the foundation on which all the rest is built. So that was all about 2,500 years ago. And now we're going to fast forward 500 years. We're going to go to something like the beginning of the Christian era, 500 years later, after the passing of the Buddha. And at this time, it seems that a new development in Buddhism happened. A development that called itself the Mahayana. The Mahayana. So Maha means great, and Yana means way or vehicle. So the Mahayana means the great vehicle, or the great way, the great path, the great road. And it called itself that in contradistinction to what it called the Hinayana, the lesser vehicle, the small vehicle, the narrow road, whatever. So the Mahayana developed, as I say, about 500 years, started to show itself about 500 years after the passing of the historical Buddha. And this Mahayana is what we're going to be looking at over the next weeks and couple of months. And I said earlier that the new year is a good time for new starts, a good time to get rid of unhelpful patterns and get back to what it's really all about. And that's true of us, but it also sometimes happens that a spiritual tradition like Buddhism needs to get back to what it's really all about. And that seems to have happened at around this time. It seems that Buddhism also needed to get back to what it was really all about. Over time, the tradition can lose sight of that. It can become, the institutions through which it expresses itself can become a bit fossilized. They can become a bit respectable. Buddhism should never be respectable. It can all become a bit hidebound. And methods of practice that are ways to an end can come to start seeming like the end in themselves. People can lose sight of what it's really all about. And this seems to have happened to some extent over the first 500 years or so of Buddhism, of Buddhist history. So that sometime around the beginning of the Christian era, some Buddhists felt that parts of the tradition had lost sight of what it was really all about. They got stuck in monasticism as an end in itself, rules as an end in itself, as ends in themselves, etc., etc., etc. So maybe people ask, well, what is it really all about? So what is Buddhism really all about? Well, that would be a good question, wouldn't it? That would be a good question to ask ourselves at the beginning of a new year. What is Buddhism really all about? What are we doing here? Any suggestions? What's it all about? Well, I'm going to suggest that what Buddhism is really all about is about getting beyond the small, narrow confines of a very limited self, breaking out of that illusory prison of a sort of narrow, separate selfhood. I'm going to suggest that that's what Buddhism is really all about. And I think that's what a lot of what the Mahayana was really trying to get back to. Because one of the main thing that it seems some Buddhists regarded parts of the traditions having lost sight of was that in the long run, the Dharma can't be just about making yourself happier. The Dharma can't be just about having nice states of mind yourself or escaping negative states of mind. I mean, okay, certainly, if we practice the Dharma, if we cultivate positive mental states, we will become happier at a deep level. I mean, I think that's just a question of experience. And for quite a long time, I think we can practice with that motivation. It's a perfectly reasonable motivation. Most of us come along to practice the Dharma because we want to experience better mental states. And we want that for ourselves, and that's perfectly valid. There's nothing wrong with that motivation. It's trying to become happier by cultivating positive mental states. It's much more reasonable than trying to cultivate happiness by getting lots of stuff, for example, or having constant entertainment or something like that. It's a perfectly reasonable approach. But there is a but. In the long run, if we make the Dharma all about just experiencing nice states of mind for ourselves and not experiencing suffering just for ourselves, then we get caught in a sort of spiritual catch-22. So I could sum the sort of spiritual catch-22 up by saying that if the Dharma is really about going beyond the self, well, you can't become more selfless from a selfish motivation. It's very difficult to get beyond the self for self-centered reasons. The Dharma tells us that the way to go beyond suffering and become happier is to loosen that tight focus on our own illusory, limited self, and to cultivate states of mind that take us beyond ourselves and connect us with others, connect us with what's higher than ourselves, connect us with the world and with other beings. But if our motivation for doing that is just our own happiness, there's a conflict. There's a conflict between the motivation and what we're trying to achieve. We can't really be less focused on ourselves by just focusing on ourselves. So we can't really become less about ourselves by focusing just on our own mental states, just on our own meditation, just on our own insight. It's all still about me. It's all still about me. Trying to become less about me by all being about me is a bit like sort of hurrying up to calm down or something like that. It's just not going to work, is it? It's just not going to work in the long run. I mean, I think I could take a simple example of that perhaps we've all come across. If we do the metta bhavana just because metta makes us feel all warm and fuzzy and nice, if we do it to have pleasant feelings ourselves, and we aren't really going beyond ourselves and shifting our concern onto the well-being of the people we're thinking about, then what we're cultivating isn't really metta. Because it's still about us. It isn't really metta at all. So it doesn't work. So it doesn't really do what it's supposed to do. So, I mean, an example of that, I think there's a story that Sangha Night, the founder of the Tree Right Buddhist order, tells. About, I think it's somebody he stayed with when he was living in India. And this guy used to regularly do the metta bhavana. So he used to do the metta bhavana, a particular time every day. And he had this servant, he was a rich man, he had a servant who, at the end of his metta bhavana, would bring him a tray of tea. And, but one day the servant got it a bit wrong. And the servant came in before he'd finished the metta bhavana. So this guy got up and started shouting at his servant, hitting him around the head, saying, "You stupid idiot, can't you see I'm trying to develop goodwill to all beings?" So you can't, doing the metta bhavana, if it's about you, it doesn't work. I mean, it's just not on. And, you know, we might find ourselves doing that. Warning signs are, you're doing the metta bhavana and somebody makes a noise in the shrine room and you think, would people just learn to be quiet in shrine rooms? It's about me, isn't it? It's about oneself, not about the other person. Perhaps we should be thinking, well, poor person, perhaps their knees hurt, you know, or whatever. So metta that's about oneself isn't metta. And at some level, spiritual practice that's about oneself isn't spiritual practice. Or going beyond oneself that's about oneself isn't going beyond oneself. We haven't liberated ourselves from our self-obsession. So if we want to get anywhere in the long run, we've got to make our practice about something bigger than ourselves. And in the original early teachings, in the Pali Canon that I talked about, the Buddha makes it plain that his disciples should see their practice in a bigger perspective than just being about having nice mental states for themselves or escaping suffering for themselves. So many, many times in the Pali Canon, the Buddha tells his followers to practice in a sort of formula that gets repeated over and over again. He says, practice for the welfare of the many, for the well-being of gods and men. So the way they saw the world at the time is not just humans, there's also these higher beings that we can't see, devas, and they're sort of friendly with humans, and you practice for them as well. You practice for the world. In a way we could see them as, I don't know, spirits of nature or something, but we're practicing for the world, for the well-being of gods and men. So the Buddha says, practice for the well-being of gods and men, for the welfare of the many. So he tells people to go out and teach the Dharma for the welfare of the many, for the well-being of gods and men. When groups of his followers fall out, which they did, they weren't all saints, so some of his followers really fell out with each other, and he really tells them off. And he says, what you are doing is not for the welfare of the many. You're letting the many down. When some of his disciples aren't practicing wholeheartedly, he tells them they're wasting the country's alms food. In other words, they're not playing their part in the common project. In the common project, the householders are feeding them. The common project is furthering the consciousness on this planet. It's the evolution of consciousness on this planet. The householders are doing their bit by feeding the full-time meditators, and the full-time meditators are not doing their bit by practicing wholeheartedly. They're wasting the country's alms food. In other words, they're not playing their part for the welfare of the many. And when the Buddha finds 3 of his disciples who are really getting somewhere with their practice, they dwell in high states of meditation, they describe themselves as being 3 in body but 1 in mind, the Buddha says that the very existence of those 3 people is for the welfare of the many, that there's a great gain for the people they live among, that they just exist. So over and over again we get this emphasis for the welfare of the many, for the well-being of gods and men. The Buddha tells his followers over and over again, part of the reason we practice is to make the world a better place. That's what he's saying. It's to make the world a better place, not just to make us happier. We humans, we make a mess. We make a mess of the world. We make a mess of the world because we're out of touch with reality. We don't see things as they are. because our awareness is narrow, and because our perspective and our sort of view of things is limited to what is good for this one little person, or just a few little people that I happen to identify with, my immediate family or whatever. So that's the problem. We are all part of the problem. We are all, not just some politician up there, you know, who does terrible things. We're all part of the problem. Our limited perspective, our sort of focus on ourselves. So an important part of the reason we practice is to stop being part of the problem and to become part of the solution. But the way we become part of the solution is to widen our perspective beyond our limited self. So to stop being part of the problem, we also have to help other people. We also take on board to help other people to stop being part of the problem and to be part of the solution. We need to be concerned not just about me becoming more enlightened, but about us becoming more enlightened, all of us becoming more enlightened, becoming a more enlightened community, becoming a more enlightened world. Ultimately, we do need to think even in terms of contributing to the evolution of consciousness on this planet. So that's what the Buddha told them their practice was about. That's what they told his followers to do, to practice for the welfare of the many. But it seems that when the Dharma had been around for quite a few hundred years, that bigger perspective on practice, at least in some quarters, got lost sight of. For some people, the goal of practice, the spiritual ideal that was called the Arahant, which literally means the noble one, had got sort of degraded somehow. It had become, the Arahant was seen as somebody who was liberated from negative mental states for their own sake, so that they didn't experience suffering. They'd just gone beyond suffering. But it was about them. It's for their own sake. And so, for that reason, I think in certain parts of the Buddhist world, parts of the Buddhist India, people felt that there was a need to get out of that unhelpful pattern, get out of that unhelpful way of viewing practice, and get back to what the Dharma is really about, going beyond the self. And so they emphasized a new version of the spiritual ideal. Instead of the Arahant, they emphasized what's called the Bodhisattva ideal, the ideal of the Bodhisattva. And Bodhi means wisdom or enlightenment. It means the wisdom of enlightenment. Sattva means being. So Bodhisattva means something like wisdom being or enlightenment being. And the Bodhisattva was seen as somebody who was practicing not just for their own sake, not just even for the sake of their own enlightenment, but for somebody who was practicing for the benefit of the many, even who was practicing to help all beings become enlightened. So, I mean, I said this was a new spiritual ideal. I said they came up with a new spiritual ideal. It wasn't really a new ideal. It wasn't really a new ideal. It was just a new name for the old spiritual ideal. It was a new name for the person who practices for the welfare of the many. Sangha, the founder of the Triratna order, has pointed out that the idea of a being with insight, an enlightened being who's out for themselves, is a complete nonsense. Because enlightenment does involve stepping beyond the limited self. Any person who's got any degree of insight will be as much about others as they're about themselves. So this idea of a sort of selfish arahant who goes and sits under a tree and really enjoys being enlightened and forgets about everybody else is a nonsense. Any sort of genuine insight means transcending our small limited selfhood. So anyone who's really got anywhere on the path will be about others as well as about themselves. So this ideal of the Bodhisattva who practices for the welfare of the many, it's not really new, but in many ways it became the defining feature of this new movement in Buddhism that was called that called itself the Mahayana. As I said, it called itself the Mahayana, the Great Way, in contrast to what it called the Hinayana, the lesser way. It's not really a good idea to use the term Hinayana because it's actually an insult. It's sort of saying to the other non-Mahayana schools, you know, you're not as good as us. But the Mahayana went on to become the dominant type of Buddhism in the world. Most Buddhists who have ever lived have been Mahayana Buddhists. So the Buddhism of China, Japan, Korea, Tibet, parts of Indochina like Vietnam, that was all largely rooted in the Mahayana. Today, the only school that's not rooted in the Mahayana that still exists is the Theravada school of Southeast Asia. Theravada means way of the elders, so it saw itself as a sort of older tradition. The Theravada school, which is the dominant tradition in places like Sri Lanka and Thailand, but all of sort of what we might call northern Buddhism is Mahayana. Incidentally, the Theravada is the school that Sangha, the founder of the order, was ordained in himself. But he very much took on board aspects of the Bodhisattva ideal and very much sort of promoted that as an important part of our practice. So, what can we learn? What can we learn from the Bodhisattva ideal? I mean, we need to take on board the essence of the Bodhisattva ideal. The fact that we should see our practice in a bigger perspective than just about our own mental states, just about having our own nice mental states for our own enjoyment. Our practice also needs to be about others. Ideally, our practice needs to have the broadest possible perspective. We need to have a sort of mythic vision of what we're about. We need to have a vision of ourselves practicing, if you like, for the welfare of the world, for the welfare of the many, even for the evolution of consciousness on this planet. We need to have that mythic vision. But having said that, I don't think we can just take on board the Bodhisattva ideal in a literalistic manner, at least not in the form that it took when it was fully developed in traditional Buddhism. The Bodhisattva idea is a sort of myth. It's a sort of myth. So according to this myth, in its literal form, the Bodhisattva postpones their own enlightenment, refuses to enter nirvana, and instead stays in samsara, stays on the wheel, until all beings are enlightened. That's the myth, in its full form. And that's getting at something important, that we need to focus on others, on the enlightenment of others as much as on ourselves. If we focus just on getting ourselves enlightened, our practice becomes focused on ourselves. So we're back in the catch-22. We're back in the catch-22. So, as with all good myths, there's a sort of inner meaning to the myth of the Bodhisattva. And the inner meaning is precisely that we need to practice as much about others as we need to practice about ourselves. We need to get it away from just being about me and my development and my enlightenment. But as with other myths, if we take it literally, if we have a literalistic attitude to it, we get tied up. We get tied up. For example, if everybody was postponing their enlightenment until all other beings were enlightened, we would get a sort of Buddhist standoff, wouldn't we, at the gates of nirvana. No, after you. No, after you, please. No, you first. And the whole population of all the generations of humankind would be sort of jostling not to get into nirvana before everybody else. You can't take it literally. It's a myth. It's a myth. It's getting at something. Telling us we should shift our attention from ourselves to the well-being of others. A second problem with the Bodhisattva idea is if we took it literally, it could lead to us sort of thinking of ourselves as what Sangha calls a sort of cosmic social worker. Going around and doing good. I mean, doing good's much better than doing bad, but there's more to the Dharma than that. It's got to have that wisdom perspective as well. If we make it all about others and not about our own practice, it gets hollow. We do need to practice ourselves. We do need to develop ourselves. We need to meditate. We need to develop higher states in meditation. We need to seek periods of solitude in which we can go deeper into ourselves. We need to develop our wisdom. If we just focus on benefiting others, if we don't focus on developing ourselves, our practice becomes hollow and empty. We need to work on ourselves, but we need to see that in a bigger perspective. To see that it's partly about us stopping being part of the problem, becoming part of the solution, helping others to do likewise. And we have to, in order to do that, we have to work on ourselves. To become part of the solution, we have to become as strong and as potent and as wise and as warm as we can be to have the maximum positive impact on others. So the two go hand in hand. So there's two problems. The third problem with the Bodhisattva ideal, if we take it literally, is that in its original form, the Bodhisattva is seen as a very, very exalted being who's really gone quite beyond themselves and has really sort of vanished, into some, they're really, really special, really, really special. So how can we think of ourselves as being really, really special like a Bodhisattva without getting a bit big-headed? A bit like, well, I'm a Bodhisattva, you poor things, and I'm helping you to get enlightened. We can become a bit too big for our boots if we think of ourselves as a Bodhisattva. I am a Bodhisattva trying to help these poor people. Let's face it, until we're enlightened, by heck, we've got lots of silly parts of ourselves, lots of flaws, lots of foolishness. We can't think of ourselves as sort of glowing Bodhisattva that you get in the mythic accounts. And we can make trying to be a Bodhisattva another source of pride, another bit of ego, if we're not careful. Another brick in the wall of the prison of ego. I'm told that in Japan, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm told that in Japan, in at least one school, if you do certain things and go through a certain mill, you can get a certificate, which you can hang on your wall that says you're a Bodhisattva. So, the Bodhisattva ideal too, maybe you need to make a fresh start. Maybe it gets cluttered, maybe it gets lost in its own entanglements. So, we can't take the myth of the Bodhisattva in its pure form completely literally, but we have to take its inner meaning. And the way Sangha, our founder, has suggested that we might do that, what he says is it's much more healthy to think in terms of the spiritual community as a Bodhisattva that we can be part of, that we can help to create and we can be part of. We could think, for example, of our Buddhist Centre as being a Bodhisattva. It has a profoundly positive impact on a lot of people and on the world around us, and we can be part of that. So we can think of ourselves as being a small part of the Bodhisattva activity that takes place through the Sangha. We can think of ourselves as coming together with others to create a Bodhisattva, not being one ourselves. Between us, we create the Bodhisattva, and each of us individually can play their part in the Bodhisattva activity of that spiritual community. Each of us individually can play our different parts in the activity, for example, of this centre. And if we think of it this way, it puts our individual practice in a much bigger perspective. It gets the ego out of the way. We can be as wise, as loving, as positive, as generous as possible to be a more effective part of that Bodhisattva activity and to help create that wiser, more cohesive, more harmonious spiritual community, which is the Bodhisattva. We'll still have our flaws. We won't be a great exalted Bodhisattva, but that makes it much more real. But at least we will have we'll stepped out of that prison of separate selfhood to a certain extent. If we practice at least partly in that way, we will have gone some way to getting out of the catch-22. So Sangha offers us an image for this, which is quite a traditional image, of the spiritual community as the Bodhisattva. And this is the image of the 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara, which probably most of you will have seen. It's a really weird image, it has to be said. It doesn't look like anything on earth. But it's this being, the Bodhisattva of compassion, with 1,000 arms. And this being, 2 of his arms, he is holding a jewel. And that jewel is the spirit, the Bodhisattva spirit, if you like, the spirit of seeking enlightenment for the sake of all beings, the spirit of being about the evolution of consciousness on this planet, if you like. Metta at its simplest. So those are 2 of his arms. The other 998 are spread out around him, which makes him look really weird. But they're all offering different things. They're all offering different things. They're all sort of operating in harmony, but they're all offering different things to the world. Some might be books, some might be food mixers, some might be all sorts of things. Or, mops, spanners, paintbrushes, whatever. All, and he sees that as a, if you like, a symbol of individuals, each offering their separate talents, their separate temperaments, their separate beings, their individuality, not sacrificing their individuality, but all united in harmony around a common volition, if you like, this Bodhisattva volition. And he offers that as a symbol, as an archetype of the spiritual community we should be aiming to create. We are aiming to create between us the 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara. And we're also aiming to be one of its arms. That is, if you like, our reinterpretation, if you like, of the Bodhisattva ideal. Let's get it away from me being a great Bodhisattva, but let's also get our practice beyond just being about me. And we'll see the spiritual community as about being the Bodhisattva, and ourselves as contributing to it. So, okay, that's all very well. For a talk like this to have any meaning, we have to sort of relate it to our own practice. So how might we relate the Bodhisattva ideal, the inner meaning of the Bodhisattva ideal? What can we learn from it? What can we take from it? Well, I think the first thing we can take from it is being aware that any form of practice we do is not just about ourselves. We have a huge impact on others. Our mental states have a huge impact on others. If we're grumpy, it has an impact on others. If we're obsessed with craving, it has an impact on others. If we are full of metta, it has a big impact on others. The other people around us, we create like a force field that affects the other people around us. We have huge impact on our loved ones, on our friends, and on the Sangha, on everybody. So if we become aware of how much our mental states impact on others, I think it can give us a really potent motivation for practice. Our practice does become more about others. I mean, I don't know about you, but as I said, I didn't sleep very well last night and then powered myself on coffee. So I was feeling pretty grumpy, actually, when I was writing this talk. I wasn't feeling at my best at all. And to be honest, if it was just about me, I could not be bothered to get out of that state. I could not be bothered. I just want to be grumpy. I couldn't be bothered to get out of that state for my own self. But I have to come here and talk to you lot. I have got to sort of be an order member. And actually that's for me, that is a more powerful motivation to be in a good state than wanting to get out of my grumpiness because it made me feel good. I quite like my grumpiness. So, I mean, I think if we can connect with that, it can actually be quite a powerful motivation to practice. We practice not just for ourselves, we practice for others. Because we are always having an impact on others. It's not like our mental states don't have an impact on others. They really, really, really do. And one of the best gifts we can give to others is be in a good state and not be in a bad state. So I think that's one thing we can learn from the Bodhisattva ideal. Really clock how much difference it makes to other people, the people we love included, the state we're in. And just how the way we are actually sends out ripples that affect the world in a way. I think the second thing is never forget the central importance of metta. Metta connects us to others. And never forget the central importance of metta. There's a sort of near enemy of Dharma practice which is quite prevalent in the West, which almost ignores metta, almost ignores Sangha, and focuses all on me and my mindfulness, my insight. And it's not going anywhere. It's not going anywhere. It's a sort of, it's a perversion of the Dharma. The Dharma is about connecting, going beyond the self. So, to make our practice real, to make our attempts to be beyond the self real, we have to practice metta. And also, we have to ground ourselves in metta. And also, we have to clock what metta is. As I said, if we try and make metta just a warm, fuzzy feeling that makes us feel good, it's not metta. Metta is a volition, a wanting, a deep wanting the well-being of others. And I think it's really important that we connect with that when we do the metta bhavana. It's a wanting others to be well, happy, wanting others to progress. It's got to have that sort of volitional element. I want this to happen. We're connecting our volition with this bigger volition, the volition of, if you like, the Bodhisattva Ideal. So that's two things. Become aware of the impact we have on others and how our practice really does affect others, and never forget the importance of metta. And the third one I'd like to offer is take on board the absolutely central importance of Sangha. The fact that creating Sangha is a really, really important part of the way we go beyond ourselves, way we go beyond the limited self. It's a really important part of our practice. We can kid ourselves. Practice is not just about meditation. And if we limit our practice to meditation in solitude and when we can really kid ourselves. We can think, I've done it. I've thought I was enlightened on a meditation retreat. I really have. Oh, well, not quite. Well, I thought I was beyond problems. I get back, somebody's nasty to me, and I get grumpy. Being with other people, that's the arena in which we operate, is with other people, and that's the arena where we really find out what we're like, actually, is when we're around others. It is quite easy, I think, in solitude to think we're far more advanced than we are, but we find out when we try to come together with others to do something. So it's an important part of our practice, an important part of the Triratna approach, if you like, to practice, is that our practice needs to be, at least in part, about the creation of Sangha. But that's an important part of the way we go beyond ourselves. Without Sangha, I mean, there's some really obvious reasoning behind this. Without Sangha, none of us are going to get anywhere. We are not spiritual superstars, or at least I'm not. I don't know whether you think you are, but we don't get anywhere without Sangha. We need the support of others to get anywhere. So we could almost argue that the creation of Sangha is more important than our own practice. I think that would be dangerous. But the creation of Sangha is really crucial. Without Sangha, we get nowhere. And we can all contribute to the creation of Sangha. We can all come together with others to create Sangha, to create that 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara. We can all play our part in that. We can do that in all sorts of ways. We can do it through our practice of generosity. In whatever form that takes, we can make our various contributions, or of all different sorts. We can do it by cultivating friendships within the Sangha. We can do it just by being here. You know, you are doing it by being here. We are creating Sangha. If none of us come, we haven't got Sangha. Okay? So just being here creates Sangha, and making the effort to be in a positive state while we're around others helps to create Sangha. So those are my three suggestions for making the Bodhisattva, the inner meaning of the Bodhisattva Ideal part of our practice. Clock the effect we have on others and make that part of our motivation. Make metta central and make it about others. And take on board this idea that creating Sangha is a practice. Creating it and participating in it is a really crucial practice. And it's a particularly crucial practice, I think, for us in the West, because we've got such a tendency to be individualistic and to think and practice in an individualistic way. So if we can see our practice in that way, as coming together with others, to create spiritual community, to create that 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara, we will already have taken an important step outside of the prison of our isolated, separate selfhood. We already have gone a long way. We might still have loads of flaws, but we will still have loads of flaws. We'll still have plenty of negative patterns, we'll still have plenty of little stupidities, but we will have taken at least the first step towards a more expansive self, towards enlightenment. So I think the creation of Sangha is maybe the crucial one. I mean, it depends on the others, but I think it's a really, really crucial practice for us. And almost a really crucial contribution of the Triratna approach, that is such an important part of our practice, because it so much counteracts the sort of individualistic effects of our society, the mores that we get in the West. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you.